All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, we're just going to jump into the study of economics here. So, chapter one is really going to look at some definitions, some basic ideas, and really defining some terms to help us discuss these different concepts. And ultimately, we're going to look at a couple of examples as well to help you guys understand these concepts. And I think that's what you'll realize about our study of economics is it's a lot of terms, but it's also understanding these examples and how they show themselves in the real world. So, first of all, what is economics? A lot of people will just say, simply money. I mean, money is definitely a component of it, but it's really when we look at the definition and need to know this specific definition that economics is the study of how people make choices to satisfy their wants. And ultimately, what we talk about are there is um, unlimited wants, but only a finite amount of time, a finite amount of money that can be spent. And so, because there's this issue of unlimited wants, you have to make choices to satisfy your needs. So, for example, you have to choose how you spend your time. There's only 24 hours in a day, that's finite. But you have unlimited things that you could do during that time. And so, economics would be how do people choose to spend their time. So we could talk about this from a macroeconomic perspective where you look at governments deciding, okay, people are unemployed, they need maybe cash to get them going. How does that affect behavior? And then when you look at businesses, okay, how many people are going to be hired? So when we've talked about government, I give the example of my mother-in-law's business because when you talk about something like Obamacare, if you have X number of employees, you have to give Obamacare. But if you have less than that amount, then you do not. And so that's going to influence how people or businesses make decisions. And so economics, when you talk about people and firms, businesses making decisions, that's microeconomics. And then when you talk about governments, businesses interacting with each other, that would be the study of macroeconomics. But really, it's the study of these choices and ultimately the role that incentives play in this too. So, two major terms, and this comes back to the crux of the definition that you have to satisfy these unlimited wants. And so, what you talk about is knowing the difference between a scarcity and a shortage. Scarcity is unlimited, things are always scarce. You could say that scarcity is a permanent state of being. So, why is gold valuable? Well, because it's scarce. The reason why gold is more valuable than lead is because there's so much more lead, there's a greater supply of lead than there is for gold, and so that makes gold more valuable. And so you could even talk about this with other precious metals. Why is platinum more valuable than gold? Well, because it's more scarce. And so, because there's essentially unlimited demand for gold by people, by governments, ultimately people are going to have to make choices because of the limited amount. Think about oil prices. Oil is scarce. There's only a certain amount of crude oil that's been packed for millions of years under pressure, and ultimately, when it runs out, that's going to be an issue. But scarcity is a permanent state, whereas a shortage is there's a limited amount or there's no amount, but it's temporary. Shortages are temporary. Scarcity is permanent. Shortages are temporary. So the example I gave is, buying a Nintendo Switch. Okay, Nintendo ultimately is trying to make more, but they cannot keep up with the demand, or they can manufacture demand by showing that their Switch is sold out. But ultimately, once they make more and once more and more people have it, the demand will go down and the shortage will disappear. Another good example of a shortage would be during the time of a hurricane, or even right now, what we're looking at with the coronavirus. Ultimately, hand sanitizer is in a shortage right now, but it's not scarce. Well, it is, excuse me, it is scarce because there's only a certain amount and there's also a shortage. So you can have a shortage and it can be scarce at the same time, but shortages are temporary, scarcity is permanent. So this gets us into the main problem, the main issue. So because everything is scarce and people have to make choices because there's only a finite amount of goods And so, kind of relating this to the current crisis is when you talk about local, state, and federal responses, there's only a certain amount of supplies. And so, the local government has to make choices based on the citizens that they're, trying to help, trying to control and benefit. And then, when you talk about toilet paper, masks, and hand sanitizer, this is currently in a shortage, and because it cannot or will not be provided, either because people are price gouging or people are just panic shopping, this is going to ultimately affect how people make choices. And then even when you talk about ventilators, okay, ventilators in general are scarce because there's only a certain amount. But then when you have the increased demand for ventilators with something like the coronavirus, it's an issue because they're both in a shortage and they're also scarce. And then when you talk about something like the stimulus package, okay, there's only a certain amount of tax dollars that we can spend. Of the $2 trillion that is being passed, how exactly is that going to be spent? So the Trump administration's decision to give UBI potentially $1,000 to taxpayers, that's an example of making a choice based on the scarcity, and the scarcity in this case is the tax dollars. So, looking at economics from the very basic sense, you need to absolutely know each of these four things. And then I will also give you guys an example as well. I'll give you a couple examples. But understand the factors of production. This is at the crux of economics. This is what we look at when we are trying to create things to help people make choices. And so, getting into it, when you talk about land, labor, capital, talk about governments. In the United States, we have capitalism, which means that for the most part, these ideas, land, labor, and capital, are controlled by the people, by the firms, by the person in the marketplace. Whereas when you talk about a communist country, or like Soviet Russia, how they were specifically their own form of communism, the state controls the land, labor, and capital, and the people don't really have a say in it. So when you talk about the land, these are your raw materials. So let's say we're making Nike shoes. So ultimately, the raw materials to make Nike shoes, the land to make Nike shoes, is rubber, the different shoelaces, and just all the raw materials that go into making the actual shoes. Then, when you talk about the labor is specifically effort. And so, in this case, the labor is if someone is running the conveyor belt and they put the shoe on the conveyor belt, that's the labor to make Nike shoes. Putting the shoes on the conveyor belt, running it through the machine, pressing the necessary buttons in order to do this. And so, that's how those two interact. And then you add on capital. And capital is basically looking at what are the man-made resources that are used to create the Nike shoes. So in this case, it's the conveyor belt, it's the machine. So the land is the rubber to make the shoes, the labor is the person pressing the button, putting it on the conveyor belt, and then the capital is the actual shoe making machine. I know it's very simplistic, but just looking at these concepts together, and then although this doesn't seem like a very skilled job, in this case, the human capital, the skill involved to work the machine. So putting it all together, you have the Nike shoes. They're being made from raw materials. So we'll take rubber, that's the land. And then ultimately, you have the person who is running the machine and their effort in pushing the buttons. That's the labor. The capital is the machine itself. And capital is usually man made. Capital is a tool. And then human capital is your skill. So it's in the brain. So having pushed the buttons and run the conveyor belt for however long as they have, the worker would have a certain human capital. So you'd say something like an Uber driver, when they plug in their phone, their human capital is getting around town or something like that. As a teacher, my human capital is the ability to kind of modify and create lessons that help translate kind of unknown concepts into digestible parts. So looking at this, you call it, talking about production. So let's look at this with popcorn, right? So you take the land, okay, it's the actual kernels, the popping corn itself, and then when you talk about the labor, it's basically the effort to pop the corn, okay, so pouring it in the bowl, putting it in the microwave, pressing the button on the microwave, and then a corn popping device, that's the microwave, right? Or if you're doing like Jiffy Pop, you're putting it on the stove, but this is just using these together. And then if you add in human capital, it's, okay, I know not to put it in the microwave for more than a few minutes or it's going to burn, right? Something like that, which is, the worst smell. Okay. Look at something like Oreos. If we're going to make Oreo cookies, right? You have the cookies, you have the cream filling. The labor is the ability to put um, the things together, and then ultimately the cookies and the cream, and then the capital is the cookie making machine. I mean, in this case, it's just your hands putting the cookies together. But the point is you are using a tool. So usually it's handmade, and this example is not. But when in doubt, it is. Capital is a handmade, human-made object. So moving on to the next concepts here. These can get kind of tricky. But these are, again, nuts and bolts of economics, things that are definitely need to be understood. And so when you look at a trade-off is ultimately you make a choice, and then the trade-off is what you give up. And so if your choices are go to a movie or watch Netflix, if you choose go to a movie, that amount of time you're watching the movie, you are unable to watch Netflix. And so the trade-off is the alternative. The trade-off is not the choice. If you choose a movie, that's not the trade-off. If you choose a movie, the trade-off is Netflix. It's what you're giving up. And so ultimately, when we look at trade-offs, think about when you guys are looking at choosing between colleges. Okay, if you're looking at a couple UCs, a couple states, maybe Oregon, Arizona, things like that, you're going to have to weigh your trade-offs. You can only go to one school for your undergraduate degree, and so ultimately you're going to have to choose. So if it's between UCI, UC Davis, SDSU, and Arizona, you're going to choose maybe, SDSU, and then all the other schools, UCI, UC Davis, they're going to be trade-offs. Now, taking this one step further, when you talk about trade-offs more specifically, you also talk about the opportunity cost. So what this means is between the schools that you're choosing, you're choosing between UCI, UC Davis, and Arizona. And you choose UC Davis. And ultimately, your second choice was UCI. So even though you chose UC Davis, UCI is a trade off, Arizona is a trade off, but Arizona was not your second choice. Arizona was your third choice. So ultimately, with the opportunity cost, is the most desirable alternative. It's the second place. And so when you talk about sleep late or wake up early to eat breakfast, if I choose sleep late, I cannot wake up early to eat breakfast. And ultimately, in this situation, you'd say that waking up early to eat breakfast is both a trade off and an opportunity cost. So, to say this a different way, um, all opportunity costs are trade offs, but not all trade offs are opportunity costs. Now, when you talk about this decision at a more macroeconomic scale, you talk about trade-offs in this concept of guns and butter. This is oftentimes discussed with the Lyndon Johnson administration. You talk about legacy of presidents. Presidents are usually looked at based on their success in domestic programs or in foreign affairs. And ultimately, good presidents, quote unquote, effective presidents, can only have one. So the reason we talk about this with Johnson is he chose guns, Vietnam, military, and he also chose butter, Great Society, Medicare, Medicaid, and ultimately neither of these things were very successful. The war waged on past Johnson is often considered the first war that the Americans have lost. And then when you talk about Medicare, Medicaid, while perhaps good ideas, well intentioned, they are currently an anchor on our economy. So because they chose both, it wasn't effective. So it would have been better to say, excuse me, just fight Vietnam, but don't do Medicare and Medicaid, or just do Medicare, Medicaid, but don't fight Vietnam. So because he chose both, there's no trade-offs, and ultimately everything suffers. So you want to choose one or the other. So that's more of like an actual practical talk about trade-offs and opportunity costs, but definitely need to know these concepts. Now, getting into it more specifically, when you talk about economics in general, it's weighing the cost benefit analysis of a lot of different things. And so, really, what we're trying to do is become more specific, I suppose, more scientific with how we are making choices. And so, a decision making grid is exactly that. It's a graphic representation that allows you to look at, if I make this choice, what do I give up? If I make this choice, what do I give up? And if I make this choice, what am I gaining? And really seeing in a very specific way exactly what choice you're making. So you decide up here, sleep late. Okay, great. So I'm going to sleep late. I'm going to have more sleep. I'm going to have more energy. And, ultimately that's great. However, what I lose out on. Now, I lose out on several things, but the most important thing I lose out on is extra study time because I'm sleeping. Time is scarce, time is finite, so I have to decide how I want to spend my time. And so you could say that by choosing to sleep late, I give up extra study time, I give up a better grade on a test, teacher approval, parent approval, personal satisfaction. This is a trade off. All three of these are trade offs. But this is the most important alternative. This is, if I had to choose between sleep late and all of these options, my second place would be extra study time. So all of these are trade offs, but only this one is the opportunity cost because that's the most desirable alternative given up. So that's looking at sleep late. Okay, so I can see exactly what I need to do. But what if I choose to wake up early? Okay, well, here are the benefits of waking up early, better grade on tests. You can see they're just switched. So if I wake up early, I get extra sleep, or I miss out on extra sleep time. I don't get to enjoy more sleep. I may have less energy during the day. And so, really, we're just weighing cost benefit analysis. And to make this even more specific, so you're weighing choices. So if it says consider cost benefit, you're weighing the choices that you're making. And ultimately, when we say cost, it's giving up. What is it costing you? Okay, so if you do 1 hour of extra study time, you might get a C on the test, and you really only lose out on an hour of sleep. But if you do 2 hours of extra study time, you could get a B on the test, which is much better, but you're going to lose out on 2 hours of sleep. And so ultimately, what's scarce in this scenario? Time. Time is scarce. And you have to make choices. So being very specific about it, what if I do an extra hour of studying? I'm going to lose out on an hour of sleep. What am I going to get from that? I'm going to get a C. What if I spend 3 extra hours of studying time? Okay, well, I'm going to lose out on 3 hours of sleep, but I might get a B plus on the test. And so this concept that you definitely need to know, and this is oftentimes used by economists, and even they do this in their sleep. It's called thinking at the margin. You're being very specific and using numerical terms to weigh your options. And I encourage you guys, when you go through this, a decision making grid, if you're deciding between colleges, especially now when it may be very difficult, where it's impossible to visit a college unless it's virtual, make a decision making grid. Decide where you want to go to college based on the benefits foregone. What are you giving up? And this could be a great way to make a decision in that regard. So, bringing it all together, what is this study of economics? It's the study of how people make choices to satisfy their wants. People have unlimited wants, but only a finite amount of ways to satisfy their wants. And so you need to make choices because you have unlimited wants and you need to specify what wants are going to become satisfied. Okay, so let's talk about this with an example. And I've used this example in the past. It is tough now because Kobe has passed away. But understand with Kobe Bryant, a little background. When he signed his contract for the Lakers, he was 17. His mother had to co-sign his contract. But ultimately, Kobe was faced with a choice. What am I going to decide to do? Am I going to go straight to the NBA as a 17-year-old young man, or am I going to go to college? Kobe said he probably would have wanted to go to, I think, North Carolina, only because he wanted to play against Vince Carter every day. But we'll never know, because he did choose the NBA. But if we look at this more specifically, and we'll kind of run this together, is let's look at it from a decision-making grid. Okay, so if Kobe Bryant decides to join the NBA, I mean, you got fame, um, lots of money, lots of different things, right? And even just getting to play basketball every day. Okay, so those are some great benefits. So if the decision is join the NBA, which we know it was, what do you miss out on? Potentially a college degree, right? So you miss out on learning, perchance the college experience, right? Different things like that. And so really it's just saying, okay, this is what would happen if I joined the NBA. So let's look at if we join college. Benefits, you have a degree, you'd say more career options, things like that. So if I decide I'm going to go to college, right, the opportunity cost is, well, I can't join the NBA immediately. Because ultimately, it doesn't say whether or not we're going to graduate college. It just says that we're going to attend college. So for now, the opportunity cost is I can't join the NBA immediately, and so ultimately, other benefits that are foregone. I mean, when you talk about it, it'd be like I don't know, with benefits foregone for not joining the NBA is potentially miss out on the fame, you miss out on a lot of money, things like that. And notice how they go intersecting, right? So let's do this a little more specifically. Let's actually think at the margin for Kobe Bryant here. So let's just say he does join the NBA. Okay, the benefits again, fame, money, what have you. What if he does one and done college? Okay, so 1 year of college basketball and then join the NBA. The benefits is a little bit of learning, maybe maturing, and maybe you get a higher draft stock. So perhaps you would get drafted at the end of the first round if you went in straight to the NBA, which is less money because you drafted later. But what if you did 1 year of college, then you go in, you could be the number one draft pick, so you could actually make more money. Okay. So if we talk about finishing the college degree, I mean, again, more job options ultimately. But let's look at the opportunity cost. If you join the NBA, the opportunity cost is a college, right? Or even college degree. You could say like one and done. Okay, so the opportunity cost is still a college degree, but perhaps this is the better option because you can make more money over time, and ultimately finishing the college degree too is understand that you're going to miss out on the NBA potentially. Um, but I think it's also important to understand that when you talk about the opportunity cost of joining the NBA now, you can still get a college degree after you're done playing basketball. So that's, this example is not perfect, but I think it does a good job of kind of demonstrating the concepts here. So let's try it one more time. And let's do it with choosing how you guys would spend your time. So if we look at getting a full-time job, okay, so right out of college, okay, or right out of high school, excuse me, full-time job is you're going to make money now. Okay, that's definitely the benefit. Whereas going to school full time, I mean, the benefit is you're earning a degree, which potentially is more money later. That's the idea. So if I decide full time job, okay, or if I decide school full time, we have to talk about what are we going to give up. So if I choose job full time, okay, the opportunity cost, in my opinion, is probably the money. Okay, if I lack of security because I don't have other options, right? So I may have a job now and it may be money in the short term, but maybe less money over time. And then the benefits foregone if I choose a full-time job. I mean, these things can relate too. So the opportunity cost, okay, so for me, it's a matter of opinion. I'd say the money in the short term. That's the opportunity cost. But other trade-offs is I don't have security because I don't have any other options. So let's look at the other side. If I choose school full-time, I mean, the opportunity cost is money in the short term. So it's okay to kind of have them mix. And then other benefits foregone is no experience in working. And so when I'm going against someone who's worked for 4 years and someone who has a college degree, I mean, the college degree person, they don't have any experience working. So that's tough. So looking at it, thinking at the margin, making the decision at the margin is going to school full time is great because I'm earning a degree, right? And ultimately, this is good because it's more money later, ultimately, right? Um, but no money now. That's the opportunity cost, most important alternative. What about going to school part time and working part time? Okay, well, it's going to take, or I guess the benefit is you can earn money and earn your degree. So you kind of get best of both worlds, but the opportunity cost is going to take much longer to get your degree. So just looking at it very specifically. And then working full time, I mean, the benefits is much more money, perhaps a higher level of living or standard of living, eating out and going out with friends and things like that. However, the opportunity cost is losing out on job options, right? Or you could say maybe the opportunity cost is you peak salary and there's no other money to be made. So that's it in a nutshell. And this is just looking at chapter one.